Somewhere on the outskirts of Johannesburg, in the dry yellow grass of the South African Highveld, a woman is lying face down in the dirt. She has been there for days. The flies found her before the police did. She is not the first. She will not be the last. Between 2007 and 2009, in the fields and townships surrounding the town of Westonaria, Gauteng Province, at least 16 women were murdered. 19 were raped. 9 were abducted. Some bodies were found within days. Others lay in the open veld for weeks. A handful were never identified. Somewhere, families waited for them to come home. They are still waiting. The man responsible was not a stranger in the shadows. He was a neighbor, a familiar face on familiar streets, a man who spoke softly, smiled easily, and told people he was a prophet of God. He attended community gatherings. He talked about healing and faith. And when he was alone with a woman, in a field, far from any road, he became something else entirely. His name was Madumetsa Jack Mogale. He was born in September 1968. He lived less than 2 kilometers from where he dumped his victims, and for 2 full years he walked free. This is the story of 16 women who deserved to go home. It is the story of a system that was too slow to protect them, and it is the story of how a single strand of DNA finally brought a predator to his knees. To understand how Jack Mogale operated for so long without being stopped, you have to understand where he lived and what that place had become by the time he started killing. Westonaria sits about 50 kilometers southwest of Johannesburg, deep in the West Rand district of Gauteng. It is flat, dry terrain, the kind of landscape where you can see for kilometers in every direction and still feel completely alone. For most of the 20th century, Westonaria existed because of gold. The mines beneath its ground employed thousands of people. Families built lives there. The town had infrastructure, purpose, and a pulse. Then the mines began to close. The decline was slow, spanning decades. By the early 2000s, the consequences were everywhere. Unemployment climbed. Buildings stood empty. Young men with no work gathered on corners with nowhere to go. Municipal services deteriorated, and the people who stayed were mostly the ones who had no means to leave. Women in these communities carried an enormous share of the burden. They worked as domestic employees in wealthier Johannesburg suburbs, as factory cleaners, as market traders. The pay was low and the shifts were long. Most traveled on foot, before dawn in, after dark out, because they had no other option. Street lighting was poor. The routes between the townships and the main roads passed through open ground, past empty lots, alongside the rusted perimeters of decommissioned industrial sites. One of those sites was the West End Brick and Clay Factory, a sprawling, abandoned complex on the western edge of town. Its buildings were empty. Its grounds were overgrown with the same tall grass that covered the surrounding fields. It sat at the end of routes that women walked every day, and it was almost completely invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Jack Mogale had grown up in its shadow. He lived in the waterworks section of Westonaria, minutes from the factory by foot. He knew every path, every shortcut, every stretch of ground where you could take someone and be certain no one would hear. He had been preparing his hunting ground for years before the first body was found. Every predator who operates in a community, rather than preying on strangers in isolated locations, needs a social identity that makes people comfortable, a reason for women to walk with him willingly, a reason for neighbors not to ask questions. Jack Mogale had built his with care. He presented himself publicly as a pastor and prophet of the Zion Christian Church, the ZCC. Founded in South Africa in 1910, the ZCC had grown by the early 2000s into one of the largest independent Christian denominations on the continent. In working-class black communities across Southern Africa, ZCC membership carries genuine social weight. A man who says he speaks for God is not questioned. He is listened to, he is trusted, he is welcomed into homes. Mogale understood this, and he used it as the foundation of every attack. He did not approach women with threats or force, not initially. He approached them with concern. 2 survivors testified in detail about how he made first contact. He would identify a woman traveling alone, tired, distracted, or visibly struggling. He would approach her calmly, in a gentle tone, and present himself as someone with a spiritual gift, the ability to sense what others could not see. He told them they were in danger, not from him, but from a dark spirit he claimed to detect inside them. He spoke with quiet authority. He said God had sent him specifically to help her, and he told at least one victim that the spirit afflicting her could only be removed through a specific ritual, one involving traditional herbs and sexual intercourse with him as the designated spiritual intermediary. He convinced women that sleeping with him was an act of healing, arranged by God, for their own protection. This was not impulse. This was not loss of control. A man acting on impulse does not construct an elaborate theological framework and rehearse it well enough to use it on multiple victims across multiple years. Mogale had developed a script, a performance, that exploited the deepest form of trust a person can have: faith. Once a victim was isolated, once they were in the fields far from any road and any witness, the performance ended. What followed bore no resemblance to anything spiritual. His own words from court give the only direct window into his thinking. When questioned, Mogale said, "I lose control around women. I kill them if they don't give me what I want." He did not say this as a confession. He said it as an explanation, as though it were a condition beyond his management, a reflex he could not help. He accepted no responsibility. He expressed no remorse. He maintained, from the moment of his arrest to the final day of his trial, that he had done nothing wrong. The full picture of what Mogale did between 2007 and 2009 only became clear after his arrest, when investigators worked backward through unsolved cases and began assembling a timeline. What emerged was not a series of disconnected incidents. It was a sustained 2-year campaign of predatory violence, carried out by a man who returned to the same methods, the same locations, and the same type of victim, over and over again, because it worked. His confirmed victims were women traveling alone, women on their way to early morning shifts, women walking home after dark, women waiting at bus stops on the edge of town. He approached them with the religious persona, separated them from public spaces, and took them into the fields near the West End factory. The manner of killing was consistent across cases: strangulation or blunt force trauma. He used no traceable weapon. He used his hands or whatever was nearby. He left the bodies and went home. Some of those women are known to us only by the circumstances of their death. One woman was a domestic worker. She had been making the same route to her employer's home for months before the morning she didn't arrive. Her employer assumed she had quit. It took days before anyone reported her missing. Another woman worked a night shift at a local cleaning company. She finished at 5 a.m. and walked the 40 minutes home because the first taxi didn't run until 6. She was found in the grass 2 days later, less than 500 meters from her front door. December 2008 was the most concentrated period of documented violence. On December 6th, a woman was held against her will, raped, and strangled. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, another woman was attacked and killed on her way back from buying groceries. She had been out getting food for the holiday. Whatever was in her shopping bag was left in the field beside her. December in South Africa is summer. Schools are out. Families gather. The streets of Westonaria had more foot traffic than usual during those weeks. Mogale was active through all of it. Among his victims was a woman who worked as a sex worker. Her profession is worth naming directly, not because it changes anything about what was done to her, but because it explains why her death triggered so little immediate response. Sex workers face violence at disproportionate rates. Their deaths are frequently under-investigated. Their absence from a regular location is rarely treated as an emergency. Mogale knew the landscape of social invisibility in his community, and he selected victims accordingly. After killing this woman, he left a used condom at the scene. It was, in all probability, a detail he gave no thought to. It would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But the incident that most completely reveals the nature of Mogale's violence involved a woman who survived it. She was taken to the fields near the factory. She was raped. The beating that followed was so severe that her jaw was fractured. He continued the assault until she lost consciousness, then left her in the open ground and walked away. She did not die. When she regained consciousness, approximately 24 hours had passed. She was still lying in the same field. Her wounds had been exposed to the summer air long enough for flies to lay eggs. When she was eventually found and brought to hospital, maggots had formed in her injuries. She survived. She received treatment. She recovered, at least physically. And when the trial came, she appeared before the court and described in precise, consistent detail exactly what Mogale had done to her. Her testimony did not break under cross-examination. It corroborated the accounts of other survivors, the DNA evidence, and the geographic pattern investigators had established. She is not a footnote in this story. She is one of the reasons it ended. A child was also among those killed. The details remain limited in public court records, but that fact alone removes any remaining question about whether Mogale ever exercised any restraint at all. He did not. Several bodies were never identified. They appear in court documents as case numbers, unknown women found in various states of decomposition in the fields outside Westonaria. No names, no families notified, no funerals. They entered this city looking for work or passing through, and they disappeared into the grass, and the world did not notice quickly enough. South Africa has significant internal migration. Women from rural provinces, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, the Eastern Cape, move to Gauteng in search of employment. They often lose regular contact with their home communities in the process. If they disappear, the people who might report them are hundreds of kilometers away and may assume the woman has simply moved on. By the time anyone thinks to look, the trail is cold. For some of Mogale's victims, this is exactly what happened. The system did not fail them at the moment of the crime. It had been failing them for years before he ever approached them. By the time the case was fully assembled, the confirmed figures stood at 16 murders, 19 rapes, and 9 kidnappings. Investigators stated openly that the true number of victims could be higher. Some attacks may never have been reported. Some bodies may never have been found. The high-veld grass grows tall in summer, and the fields around Westonaria are large. For 2 years, Jack Mogale woke up every morning in his own home. He ate, he slept. He walked the same streets as the families of the women he had killed. He may have sat in the same church gatherings. He performed the role of a spiritual man in his community. And then he went into the fields and proved again and again what he actually was. And then, quietly, a forensic database began connecting the evidence he thought he had left behind. For the first year of Mogale's killing campaign, the South African Police Service did not know they were looking for a serial killer. This is not an unusual failure. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of serial murder investigations. When victims come from marginalized communities, when they are poor, when their social networks are fragmented, their deaths are processed differently. A woman found in a field outside a struggling town is a tragedy, but she is also, in an overburdened system, one case among dozens. Without a unifying theory, without a suspect, without early forensic connections, investigations stall and cases go cold. The early disappearances and deaths in Westonaria were treated individually. Each case was opened, investigated to the extent that resources allowed, and set aside when leads dried up. The women came from different immediate areas. They were found in different specific locations. There was no obvious connection between them, no shared workplace, no shared social circle, no known relationship. What was shared? The method of killing, the geographic concentration near the West End factory, the victim profile, took time to become visible. It required enough cases to accumulate that the pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. When it finally became undeniable, the unknown attacker was given a working designation, the West End serial killer. A dedicated investigative unit was assembled. Detectives began reviewing every unsolved case in the surrounding area. Appeals were made in the community for information, and the survivors came forward. 2 women in particular gave investigators something they had not had before: a physical description of the man who had attacked them, delivered with clarity and consistency. They described his approximate age and build. They described his manner, calm, deliberate, religious in tone. They described the approach he used, the specific language about dark spirits and divine healing, the way he led them toward the fields. 2 women, interviewed separately, who had never met each other, describing the same man in the same way. A profile existed. What investigators needed was a name. That name came through DNA. South Africa had been developing its forensic DNA infrastructure through the early 2000s, supported in significant part by the DNA Project, a non-governmental organization that had been advocating for a national forensic database for years. The system was not yet fully mature, not yet comprehensive, but it was operational. From 4 separate crime scenes linked to Mogale's attacks, investigators had recovered biological material, vaginal swabs taken from survivors who had sought medical treatment, the used condom found at the murder scene of the sex worker. DNA profiles were extracted from each sample. They were cross-referenced. All 4 matched. The same man at 4 different crime scenes across multiple months. A single DNA profile that connected murders, rapes, and survivors into one continuous case. The profile was in the system, and at some point, through a combination of the survivor descriptions, community intelligence, and the forensic database, that profile acquired a name: Madumetsa Jack Mogale, Waterworks, Westonaria, living less than 2 kilometers from where his victims were found. He was arrested. A biological sample was taken. It matched all 4 scenes. Among the 61 charges eventually filed against him was a charge of escaping from lawful custody, meaning that at some point during his apprehension or early detention, Mogale had tried to run. He did not succeed. The ghost had a face. The prophet had a cell. The trial of Madumetsa Jack Mogale was heard before the Johannesburg High Court, presided over by Judge Frans Kgomo. It would become one of the most significant criminal proceedings in South African legal history, not because it was dramatic in the theatrical sense, but because of what it revealed about the man at its center. Mogale entered a plea of not guilty on all 61 counts. Given the evidence, 4 matching DNA profiles, 2 survivor identifications, consistent witness testimony, and a geographic pattern pointing directly to him, this position was difficult to defend. But Mogale did not simply deny the charges. He went further. He claimed the entire case was a fabrication. The police had planted evidence. The witnesses were lying, and his own wife, who had provided testimony that undermined his defense, had conspired against him as part of the setup. Judge Kgomo reviewed each element of the defense case with methodical care. His conclusions were unambiguous. He described the conspiracy claims as fabricated and without foundation. He found the testimony of the survivors to be credible, internally consistent, and corroborated at multiple points by independent forensic evidence. He found the DNA evidence to be scientifically valid and correctly handled through the chain of custody. He found no basis for the defense case on any substantive charge. The prosecution secured convictions on 52 of the 61 counts. The 9 counts that did not result in conviction reflected specific evidentiary gaps in individual cases. They were not findings of innocence, and they did not alter the overall picture the court had constructed. On February 17, 2011, Judge Kgomo delivered the sentence: 16 life terms, 1 for each murder, 4 additional life terms for the rape of multiple victims in incidents severe enough to carry independent life sentences, 20 years for each of 15 further rape convictions, additional terms for kidnapping, assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and escaping from custody. The judge went beyond the numbers. In his sentencing remarks, he included a formal recommendation addressed to any future parole authority that Madumetsa Jack Mogale should be regarded as a serious and continuing danger to society for the remainder of his natural life. The earliest date at which any parole consideration could legally occur was set at 2034. As officers moved to take him from the courtroom, Mogale spoke one final time. He said, "In life there are trials. This is just one of them. I did not commit what I am accused of. I still maintain my innocence." 16 life sentences, the testimony of women he had broken and left for dead, DNA that placed him at 4 separate crime scenes, and he stood there and called it a trial of life. He was taken away. The courtroom emptied. Outside, the high-veiled sun was exactly as it always was. 16 murders, 19 rapes, 9 kidnappings. These numbers appear at the top of almost every article written about Jack Mogale because they communicate scale efficiently. But numbers are also how individual people disappear from a story. South African court proceedings involving sexual violence routinely withhold victim names from public records as a legal protection for survivors and their families. The intention is sound. The consequence is that many of the women Mogale killed exist in the public record only as initials, case reference numbers, or physical descriptions tied to the location where their bodies were found. What we know about them is fragments. Some were domestic workers making early morning commutes. One had finished her shift and was 40 minutes from home. One had been buying Christmas food and was killed on the way back. One worked nights and walked home in the hours before dawn because she could not afford the taxi. One was a sex worker whose profession made her nearly invisible to the institutions that might have looked for her sooner. One was a child, the woman who survived with a fractured jaw and maggots in her wounds went on to testify against him in open court. Whatever the lasting weight of what was done to her, and it would be condescending to claim we can measure that from the outside, she stood before a judge and described it without flinching. That required something most people will never be tested on. She is not a supporting character in this story. She is one of its most important people. The unidentified women are the element of this case that sits heaviest. No name in any record, no family informed, no grave anyone visits. They came to Gauteng from somewhere else, looking for work, for a better situation, for something, and they vanished, and the city absorbed their absence without pausing. Somewhere there are people who remember them, a mother who stopped receiving calls, a sister who assumed her sibling had just gotten busy, moved on, lost the phone, children who were told their mother had left and never came back. They were not nameless because they were unimportant. They were nameless because the world had been failing them long before Jack Mogale ever found them. Mogale was never publicly assessed by a forensic psychologist whose findings entered the court record. But the documented pattern of his behavior over 2 years tells a story that is consistent and coherent, and it does not describe a man who lost control. He was not disorganized. Disorganized killers are chaotic, impulsive in victim selection, erratic in method, prone to leaving evidence in ways that reflect a fractured mental state. Mogale was none of these things. He selected victims deliberately. Women traveling alone from communities where their absence might not trigger an immediate response. His approach was rehearsed and consistent. His crime scenes were geographically concentrated in an area he knew intimately. He returned to the same fields, the same methods, the same type of target for 2 years. That kind of consistency does not come from loss of control. It comes from a man who is fully in control and choosing every time to do exactly what he is doing. The religious framework he constructed is the most revealing element. The use of spiritual authority to manipulate victims is documented in a small but studied subset of predatory offenders. What makes it so effective is the same mechanism that makes religious trust powerful in general. We are conditioned to treat expressions of sincere faith as safe. A man who speaks of God and healing activates a fundamentally different social response than a stranger asking a woman to follow him. Mogale exploited this gap deliberately, repeatedly, and successfully enough that 2 women followed him into isolated fields, believing they were about to receive help. His courtroom behavior completes the profile. He constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory that implicated police, witnesses, and his own wife, everyone except himself. He delivered it calmly and consistently over the course of a full trial. He showed no visible distress during survivor testimony. He expressed no remorse. When sentenced to 16 life terms, he delivered a composed statement about the trials of life. A man who had genuinely lost control at the moments of his crimes would not perform this kind of sustained, coherent, calculated self-defense across months of legal proceedings. The composure in court and the composure in the field are the same composure. They belong to the same person. He always knew exactly what he was doing. He simply believed he would never have to answer for it. Madumetsa Jack Mogale is currently serving his sentences in a South African correctional facility. The earliest his case can be reviewed for parole is 2034. He will be 65 years old. Judge Kgomo's recommendation that he be considered permanently dangerous is on the record and will be placed before any future parole board. It carries no binding legal force. Whether it will be enough depends on decisions that have not yet been made by people who have not yet been appointed. The case left several concrete things in its wake. For the DNA project in South Africa, the Mogale conviction was a landmark. 4 crime scenes, 4 matching profiles, 1 arrest. The case demonstrated exactly why a functional national forensic database matters, and it became part of the evidence base used to advocate for stronger legislation. In 2013, South Africa passed the Criminal Law Forensic Procedures Amendment Act, which significantly expanded the legal framework for DNA collection and use in criminal proceedings. The Mogale case was part of the argument that made it happen. For the community of Westonaria, the aftermath was quieter. There were no large public memorials, no formal inquiry into how a man managed to kill 16 women over 2 years before a single charge was filed. The community grieved privately in the way that communities shaped by poverty and neglect have learned to grieve, without public attention, without institutional acknowledgement, and then they continued, because continuing is what survival requires. But the questions that the Mogale case raises have never been formally answered. Why did it take 2 years? At what point did the pattern of deaths near the West End factory become visible to police, and what was done about it? Were there missing persons reports filed during that period that received inadequate follow-up? Were there earlier complaints about Mogale, incidents of assault or threatening behavior that never made it into an investigation? These questions were not examined in a public inquiry. They remain open. The unidentified victims remain unidentified, and the conditions that made Mogale possible, the poverty, the isolation, the institutional tendency to treat the deaths of marginalized women as low-priority cases, those conditions did not end with his conviction. They are structural. They predate him by decades and will outlast him by decades more. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, because it means the Mogale case is not simply the story of one dangerous man who was caught and put away. It is also a mirror. It shows in sharp detail what happens when a society decides, through policy, through underfunding, through indifference, that some lives are less worth protecting than others. Mogale saw that decision clearly. He built his entire operation on top of it. He is in a cell now. The decision is still out there. In the fields outside Westonaria, the grass grows tall every summer. The West End factory still stands, empty, rusted, silent. The paths that women once walked to their early morning shifts are still there. And 16 women who walked those paths never made it home.